If you are not interested in even the basic technicalities of building database systems, skip this video and the next one and jump to the demonstration videos in parts 4, 5, and 6 of this series. In part 1 of this series, I briefly outlined some basic aspects of CIPO's trademark XML data, and I showed how you can download the data. Suppose you do that. Suppose you download the latest global dataset. As of right now, that's the 5 October 2019 dataset, which contains over 1.6 million XML files. So, with all of that data, you should be ready to do some amazing things, right? Well, no. Apart from looking at the XML files one by one, or doing simple text searches on groups of, or all of, the XML files, you can't really do much with the files by themselves. To do anything interesting, you need to pull the information out of the XML files and put it into some sort of database. If you do that, you can do some much more interesting things with the data, as I'll demonstrate in parts 4, 5, and 6 of this series. Here's an example of something interesting that you might want to do. You can cross-check your docket to make sure that you've received all of CIPO's correspondence pertaining to the files on your docket. Recall that in part 1 of this series, we saw that CIPO's trademark XML data includes details of every event that occurs throughout the prosecution of a trademark application, just as you can see via CIPO's online trademark database. This slide and the next one show one way of making use of that event data. As shown up here in the top left, we begin with the most recent edition of CIPO's global file. That'll be roughly 1.6 million files. You also need the weekly updates that have been released since that edition of the global. Depending on how long ago the global was released, the weekly updates might be, say, another 800,000 XML files. So collectively, you'll have 2.4 million XML files. The good news is that you don't need all of them. You only need the ones corresponding to the marks that are of interest to your firm. That means you'll only need to keep XML files that correspond to cases that are on your firm's trademark docket, plus any others that your firm is watching, for example, because you want to oppose them when they're published in the Trademarks Journal. And don't forget ongoing opposition or Section 45 cases where your firm represents an opponent or a Section 45 requester. Those cases probably are not on your firm's trademark docket because you're not the agent of record for those cases. But they're definitely of interest to your firm. So, you wind up with a list of application serial numbers that are of interest to your firm. CIPO's naming convention for its trademark XML files uses the application serial numbers, so it's easy to cycle through those 2.4 million XML files, picking out only the ones that are of interest to your firm. For most firms, that'll be only a few thousand XML files. You then shred those into a database. I'll explain shredding in a moment. So now you've got a database containing the most recent action event details for the applications of interest to your firm so far as the global release from CIPO is concerned. And now you're ready to go to step 2, which is the next slide. I'll just pause to mention that when I refer to serial numbers, I'm not just talking about pending trademark applications. I'm also talking about registered trademarks, published official marks, etc. CIPO continues to use the application serial numbers in its XML file names even after cases mature to registration. So you need to focus on serial numbers if you're working with CIPO's trademark XML data. So here's step 2. Most of this slide is exactly the same as what you saw in step 1. All this slide is telling you is that in order to stay in sync with CIPO, you have to go through the same process each time CIPO publishes a new weekly update. So you pick out of each weekly update the XML files corresponding to the applications, trademarks, of interest to your firm, and you shred those into your database. Now here's the critical part. For each weekly update, you look at the action events in the XML files for the applications of interest to your firm, and you compare those against the action events that are already stored in your database. If you find an action event that is not already in your database, you make a note of it and you tell your docket department about it. Most of the time, your docket department is going to ignore the notification because they're already aware of the action event. For example, because they've received and docketed a piece of correspondence reflecting that event. But CIPO correspondence sometimes gets misdirected, and those are the ones that this system will catch. Let's talk about shredding. Shredding is the process of extracting information from an XML file, possibly transforming the information in some way, and loading the information into a database. An XML shredder is a computer program capable of performing the shredding process. There are two basic types of shredders, those which use a staging database and those which do not. In the first case, the shredder extracts information from the XML file and loads it into the staging database. Additional work is then required to transfer the information from the staging database into the target database. Shredders that do not use a staging database load the information directly into the target database. The commercially available shredders that I've seen use staging databases. Typically, they analyze the structure, or schema as it's known, of the input XML files and construct a staging database having a matching schema. They then load the XML information into the staging database. A major advantage of this approach is that with very little effort, your XML information is quickly available in relational form. And sometimes that's all you need to get the job done, especially in a one-off situation. Commercial shredders have some disadvantages. Usually they operate on an all-or-nothing basis, meaning that all of the information from every element in every XML file is loaded into the staging database. That can be a problem if you're working with hundreds of thousands or millions of XML files, which you will be doing if you intend to work with CIPO's global release. Some commercial shredders will only accept input files in small batches. For example, a few hundred or maybe a few thousand files, and they'll choke if you try to feed them larger batches of files in one go. You could write code to auto-feed right-sized batches of files to a commercial shredder, but there are further problems. If your XML files are complex, for example, if they contain hundreds of multi-level nodes, then the schema of the staging database will be correspondingly complex. Possibly it'll be downright weird. In that case, you'll spend a lot of time scratching your head wondering how to work with that schema. And, you guessed it, CIPO's trademark XML files typically have hundreds of multi-level nodes. Probably you're only interested in the information contained in at most a few dozen of those hundreds of multi-level nodes. An all-or-nothing commercial shredder cannot be configured to select information from only the nodes you're interested in and ignore everything else, at least not the commercial shredders that I've seen. So you're stuck with a massive staging database full of junk you're not interested in. Often you wind up investing a lot of effort deleting the junk so you can focus on the leftover information that actually matters to you. But it's still just a staging database. You still need to move the information into your target database. Commercial shredders typically expect to encounter XML files consisting of invariant, multiple repeating sets of nodes or elements. But CIPO's trademark XML files contain only one set of nodes per file. That's illustrated in this slide by analogy to Microsoft's books.xml sample file. By invariant, I mean that you get the same set of nodes in every XML file as you see here in the right column. However, CIPO's trademark XML files do not contain the same sets of nodes in every file. Some nodes exist in some files, but not in others. There's nothing odd about that. In some cases, certain information is undefined in relation to a particular trademark. For example, if an XML file pertains to a word mark, you won't find any nodes containing Vienna classification information in that file. But you will find nodes containing Vienna classification information in an XML file pertaining to a design mark. In fact, none of CIPO's trademark XML files contain every possible node or anything close to it. There are many, many different possible combinations of nodes which may be included in or excluded from any particular one of CIPO's trademark XML files, depending on the specific mark and circumstances to which that file pertains. This node existence variability can wreak havoc on the staging database created by a commercial shredder, because the commercial shredder continually updates and thereby further complicates the staging database's schema. Specifically, as the shredder encounters files containing nodes which have not previously been represented in the schema gets updated. Shredders that do not use a staging database are custom designed to work with specific XML files and with a specific target database of your own design. In the next part of this series, I'll talk about one possible target database design. The custom design approach overcomes the disadvantages I mentioned previously in relation to commercial shredders. You can feed arbitrarily large batches of files to a custom shredder if you code it properly. You can design a custom shredder to traverse complex, non-repeating, that is variable, multi-level node structures. You can pick and choose the nodes from which you want to extract information and ignore everything else. The trade-off, of course, is the time and effort required to design, build, and debug a custom shredder. The intricacies of designing and coding a custom XML shredder are well beyond what can be conveyed in a brief series of videos like this. However, as coding tasks go, creating a custom XML shredder is not especially difficult, particularly if you have prior coding experience with XML files and databases, or have access to coders with such experience. Feel free to email me if you have questions or comments.